My daughter sent me an email she meant for her husband. The subject line read, "Dad's situation." The body said, "We need to get him declared incompetent before he marries that woman. Once we control the trust, we sell the lake house and split it. He's 71 and clearly losing it." I read it twice. Then I poured myself a bourbon, sat on my porch, and started making phone calls. By the end of the month, my daughter and her husband were sleeping in his mother's basement. The lake house belonged to a young couple from Minneapolis, and I was on a Greek island with the woman my daughter wanted me locked away for loving. Before I tell you how, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and hit subscribe if you've ever had family treat your kindness like a debt they didn't owe. My name is Howard Pemberton. I'm 71 years old, and until last spring, I lived in a house I built with my own 2 hands in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Spent 41 years as a structural engineer designing bridges across the upper Midwest. The kind of work where, if you make one mistake, people die in cold water. Teaches you to measure twice. Teaches you to read load patterns. Teaches you that the weakest point in any structure is almost never where the untrained eye expects it to be. I should have applied that to my own daughter sooner. The lake house wasn't actually a lake house. It was a 1962 cedar A-frame on Lake Wissota that my wife Patricia and I bought in 1989 for $94,000. We raised our daughter there during summers. I refinished every floor. I rebuilt the dock 3 times. When Patricia died of pancreatic cancer in 2017, I scattered some of her ashes from that dock at sunrise, and I made a promise to her that I'd keep the place exactly the way she loved it. She wouldn't recognize what it became. My daughter is named Bridget. Patricia chose the name. She'd had a French pen pal as a girl, and always loved the sound of it. Bridget is 39 now. She works in pharmaceutical sales in Minneapolis, lives in a $4,200 a month condo in the North Loop, and drives a leased BMW X5. Her husband, Conrad, is a personal trainer who owns half of a CrossFit gym that, from what I can tell, has never turned a profit in 6 years. They have no children. They have 2 French bulldogs that cost more per month in vet care than I spent on Bridget's first year of college. For 3 years after Patricia died, Bridget and Conrad came up to the lake house every weekend from May through September. At first I thought it was kindness. A widowed father, a grieving daughter, the place full of her mother's memory. We'd sit on the dock and she'd cry sometimes, and I'd put my arm around her and feel like maybe I was doing this part right. Then I started noticing things. The wine cellar Patricia had built. We had maybe 60 bottles in there, some of them gifts, some from a trip to Sonoma in 2003. By the summer of 2019, there were 11 bottles left. Brigitte said the humidity must have ruined them. I checked the humidity. The humidity was fine. The Honda outboard motor I kept on the boat. One Sunday I went down to take it out, and the motor was scratched all to hell along the prop housing. Conrad swore he didn't know what happened. 3 weeks later, I found out he'd been letting his buddies water ski behind it on Saturdays when I drove back to Eau Claire to check on the main house. The little brass compass Patricia kept on the main tower. Her grandfather brought it back from the Pacific in 1945. One weekend it was just gone. Bridget said it must have fallen behind something. I looked behind everything. I found it 8 months later listed on an estate sale website by a dealer in St. Paul. It had Patricia's grandfather's initials etched on the back. There was no question. I didn't confront her about it. I'm ashamed to say that now. I told myself she was grieving. I told myself a compass was just a compass. I bought it back for $340 and put it in a drawer where she wouldn't see it. That was my first mistake. Not the buying it back, the not saying anything. Things shifted for me about 2 years ago when I started volunteering at the Chippewa Valley Museum. They needed someone to help catalog historical engineering drawings. That's where I met a woman named Constance Yarbrough. She'd retired from teaching American literature at UW Stout and volunteered 3 days a week with the archival photography collection. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and laughed at things that weren't supposed to be funny, like the way one of the trustees pronounced the word Wednesday. We started having coffee at the little cafe across from the museum. Then lunch. Then I drove her home one night in February when the snow came down hard, and somewhere between the museum parking lot and her front door, I realized I hadn't felt that kind of nervous since I was 19 years old. I want to be clear about something. I loved Patricia for 43 years. I still love her. Loving Constance didn't take anything away from that. Patricia would have liked her. Patricia, in fact, said something to me about 3 months before she died. She said, "Howard, when I'm gone, don't you dare sit alone in this house feeling sorry for yourself. Find someone to argue with. You're insufferable when you have nobody to argue with." I'm telling you that because I want it on the record. Patricia gave me permission. She did it on purpose. I told Bridget about Constance over Easter dinner last year. I had Constance there at the table. I thought it would be easier with her present, that Brigitte would see what I saw, that this was a kind, intelligent, decent person. Brigitte was civil at the table. Cold but civil. Conrad barely looked up from his phone. After dinner, while Constance was helping me clear plates, I overheard Bridget in the hallway on the phone with someone, probably her friend Audra. She was using that voice she has, the clipped one. She said, "She's a vulture. She's circling. He's 70 years old. What does he think he's doing? She's going to take everything Mom built." What Mom built? Like Patricia had built it alone. Like I hadn't drawn the plans for the addition in 1994 on graph paper at our kitchen table. Like I hadn't paid for every shingle on that roof. I didn't say anything that night either. That was my second mistake. 6 months ago, Constance and I started talking about getting married. Nothing dramatic. We weren't going to throw a big party. We talked about a small ceremony at the courthouse, a dinner with maybe 10 people, and a trip to Greece in the fall because Constance had wanted to see the Aegean since she was a girl reading the Iliad. I made the mistake of telling Brigitte about Greece before I told her about the marriage. 2 weeks later, I was on my laptop checking my email at the kitchen table. Bridget had set up some kind of family Google account years back so we could share photos. Most of the time it just sat there. But on a Tuesday morning in March, an email landed in my inbox that wasn't meant for me. She'd hit reply all instead of reply. I think she'd been emailing back and forth with Conrad, and at some point I'd been on a thread, and her phone auto-filled to the wrong field. The email was from Bridget to Conrad. It read, "Talk to Audra's brother again. He says we have a real shot if we move now. The trick is the timeline. We need to get him declared incompetent before he marries that woman. Once we control the trust, we sell the lake house and split it. He's 71 and clearly losing it. Audra's brother said we can use the Greece trip as evidence of impulsive behavior. Also, you need to start documenting things. Like when he forgets where he put his keys, take a video. We have until probably September to get this moving, or it's over." I read it once. I felt my hands get cold the way they used to get cold when I was driving home from a job site in February with the heater broken. I read it again. The third time I read it, I noticed something I'd missed. Audra's brother. I knew who Audra's brother was. He was an attorney in Minneapolis named Davis Hollenbeck. I'd met him at Bridget's wedding 8 years ago. He specialized in elder law, which is a pleasant euphemism for taking control of old people's assets. I closed the laptop. I sat for a while. I want to tell you I didn't cry, but I did. I cried for about 10 minutes. Then I got up, washed my face in the kitchen sink, and made the first phone call. The first phone call was to a man named Roland Petruzzi. Roland was a structural engineer I'd worked with for 20 years before he switched careers in his 50s and became a forensic accountant. He's worked on a lot of estate cases. I didn't tell him anything specific that morning. I just asked him to have lunch with me on Thursday. The second phone call was to my own attorney, Margaret Schoberg. Margaret had handled Patricia's estate. She'd known us since 1996. I told her I needed an emergency appointment and that it was about Bridget. I could hear her exhale on the other end. Margaret had warned me, gently, 2 years ago, that I should consider revising the trust documents. I'd put it off because I didn't want to think about it. Now I was thinking about it. The third phone call was to my doctor, Dr. Anand Reddy at Mayo Clinic Health System. I told his receptionist I needed a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, neurological workup, the whole battery. She tried to schedule me for July. I told her I'd pay out of pocket, and I needed it within the next 10 days. She got me in the following Wednesday. I didn't call Constance until that night. I didn't want to scare her. When I did call, I sat on the porch with the phone and watched the sun go down over the back fence, and I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Howard, I want you to listen to me. I love you. I don't want any of your money. I don't want the lake house. If your daughter is doing what you think she's doing, you do not protect her from this. You let it happen. Do you understand me?" I understood her. The cognitive evaluation took 6 hours over 2 days. They tested memory, executive function, processing speed, language, visuospatial reasoning. Dr. Reddy called me into his office on the Friday and told me my scores were in the 96th percentile for my age group. He said, and I quote, "Howard, your brain is in better shape than most 55-year-olds I see." I asked him to put it in writing. I asked him to be specific. I asked him to date and notarize it. He looked at me a little funny and said, "Are you in some kind of trouble?" I said yes, but I wasn't going to be in it for long. That report cost me $3,400. It was the best money I ever spent. Margaret Sherbird's office was where the real work happened. Over 4 meetings across 3 weeks, we restructured everything. The trust that Patricia and I had set up in 2008, which named Bridget as primary beneficiary, was revocable. I revoked it. We drafted a new trust. The new trust named Constance as a beneficiary, along with 2 charities Patricia had cared about, the Eau Claire Public Library Foundation and the Mayo Clinic Pancreatic Cancer Research Fund. Bridget's share was reduced to a one-time disbursement of $25,000, payable on my death, which Margaret called a no-contest provision sweetener. The lake house, the cedar A-frame on Lake Wissota where Patricia and I had been happiest, I put on the market. That decision took me a week. I sat on the dock for an entire Saturday in May with my dog, an old Brittany Spaniel named Marlowe, and I cried more in those 4 hours than I had since Patricia's funeral. The lake house wasn't a building. It was a coordinate in time where a younger version of me was still teaching a 6-year-old Bridget how to bait hook. It was where I'd promised Patricia I'd keep things the same. But Patricia had also told me in her last week that I was insufferable when I was alone, and the lake house, with what Bridget had been doing to it, with what she now wanted to do to me through it, wasn't Patricia's anymore. It was just leverage. I called a realtor I'd known for 30 years, a woman named Henrietta Valbush, who specialized in lakefront property. I told her I needed it sold fast, cash buyers preferred, and I wanted it off MLS for the first 2 weeks because I didn't want Bridget finding out from a Zillow alert. Henrietta brought me 3 private showings in 8 days. The third was a couple from Minneapolis, both architects in their early 40s, who walked through the place once and offered $612,000 cash, 60-day close. I accepted on the spot. Meanwhile, Bridget and Conrad had no idea any of this was happening. Bridget called me twice during this period. Both times, she was warm in a way she hadn't been since Patricia died. She asked how I was doing. She asked about Constance, which was new. She asked if I'd like to come down to Minneapolis for a weekend so the 3 of us could really get to know each other. She suggested Memorial Day weekend. I knew exactly what Memorial Day weekend was for. It was for documentation. They wanted me on video, they wanted me in their condo, on their phones, looking confused or repetitive or whatever else they could edit together to send to Davis Hollenbeck. I told her Memorial Day weekend was perfect. I'd love to come. Then I called Roland Petruzzi. Roland and I sat in the back booth of a diner on Water Street in Eau Claire, and I showed him the email. I showed him my financial records for the past 6 years. I showed him the cognitive evaluation. He read everything carefully. Then he looked up and said, "Howard, you understand what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to get you adjudicated incapacitated. In Wisconsin, the standard is high, but not impossible, if you have a sympathetic petition and a doctor willing to play ball. Hollenbeck has done this before. I can name 3 cases off the top of my head. I asked Roland what he'd do in my position. He said, I'd let them try. Then I'd ruin them with it. We talked for 2 more hours. Roland walked me through what's called an anticipatory counter petition. Essentially, if I knew they were going to file for guardianship, I could preemptively file documentation that established my capacity, exposed their motive, and made any future attempt look like exactly what it was. He recommended I also consult with a litigator who specialized in elder financial abuse, because what Brigitte and Hollenbeck were planning, depending on how aggressive they got, could constitute attempted financial exploitation under Wisconsin Statute 46.90. That's a felony. The penalties include up to 6 years and the loss of any inheritance rights automatically. I want to be clear about my state of mind at this point. I was not enraged. I was not vengeful in some hot-blooded way. What I was a structural engineer looking at a load-bearing problem. My daughter and her lawyer friend had identified what they thought was the weakest point in the structure. An old man, alone, in love, distracted. They'd designed a plan around that assumption. Their assumption was wrong. The weakest point in this structure was not me. It was them. It was their email habits. It was their lawyers' prior cases. It was Conrad's gym, which I learned through Roland's preliminary digging was actually $187,000 in debt and being kept afloat by Brigitte's salary. It was Autra's brother Davis Hollenbeck, who had been sanctioned by the Minnesota State Bar in 2019 for an irregularity in a guardianship petition that he'd quietly settled with the family of an 84-year-old widow. I went to Memorial Day weekend in Minneapolis with 3 things in my pocket: a small audio recorder, the cognitive evaluation, and a copy of the new trust documents in a sealed envelope. The weekend went exactly the way I expected. Brigitte was unctuously sweet. Conrad cooked steaks badly. They asked leading questions over dinner about whether I'd been feeling forgetful lately and whether I'd had any falls. Conrad mentioned 3 separate times that his uncle had developed dementia at 73 and the family had been so glad they caught it early. Brigitte brought out an old photo album at one point and asked me to identify people in it, watching me carefully. I named everyone correctly. I told 3 jokes I'd told them at last Christmas, just to confirm the long-term memory was working. I solved a New York Times Sunday crossword in front of them at the breakfast table on the second morning, in pen, in 31 minutes. On the last evening, after dinner, I asked Brigitte if we could talk. Just the 2 of us, on the patio. She came out smiling. Conrad stayed inside, watching through the sliding glass door, holding his phone. I sat across from her. I poured us each a small glass of brandy. I said, Brigitte, before I leave tomorrow, I want to give you something. I handed her the sealed envelope. I said, don't open it tonight. Open it on Tuesday morning, after you're back at work, when you have time to read it carefully. There's a letter in there explaining everything. She took the envelope. She looked at me with that face she has. The one where she's trying to figure out if she's won or lost. I just smiled and finished my brandy and went to bed. The envelope contained 3 documents. The first was a copy of the cognitive evaluation from Mayo with Dr. Reddy's certification. The second was a copy of the revised trust. The third was a letter from me. It was 1 paragraph long. I won't read the whole thing. But the key sentence was, I know about your email to Conrad on March 18th. I know about Davis Hollenbeck. I know about the plan. I'm not angry. I'm just done. I drove home Tuesday morning. I left Minneapolis at 6 a.m., so I'd be back in Eau Claire before she opened the envelope. I didn't want to be reachable. She called me at 9:47 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 9:51, and 9:54, and 9:54, and 58. By 11 a.m., I had 23 missed calls and 14 text messages. I didn't read any of them until that evening. When I did, the tone moved through 5 distinct phases in about 4 hours. Phase 1 was confusion and faux concern. Dad, I don't know what email you're talking about. Please call me. Phase 2 was injured innocence. I can't believe you'd think this of me, after everything I've been through. Phase 3 was negotiation. Dad, can we talk about this? I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Let's get on Zoom. Phase 4 was anger. You're being manipulated by that woman, and you can't even see it. Phase 5, at around 9 p.m., was threats. If you go through with this, you'll regret it. I have rights. I'll fight you in court. I responded once, at 10 p.m. I wrote, Brigitte, my attorney's name is Margaret Schoberg. Any further communication should go through her. Please do not call this number again. She called my number 11 more times that night. Then she stopped. The lake house closed on a Friday in late June. The architects from Minneapolis brought their 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, to the closing. The girls ran down to the dock while we were signing papers. I watched them through the window. One of them yelled to her sister to come look at a frog. I gave them the keys. I gave them Patricia's old guidebook to local hiking trails. I told them which floorboard squeaked and where the well shutoff was. I shook the husband's hand and the wife hugged me, and I drove away, and I did not look back, because if I looked back, I was going to break, and I had decided a month earlier that I was not going to break in front of strangers. I broke that night, alone, in my truck, in the parking lot of a Quick Trip on Highway 53. I sat there for about 40 minutes. Then I drove home. Constance was waiting on the porch. She'd made dinner. She didn't ask me how I was. She just put a plate in front of me and sat down across from me, and after a while she said, Patricia would be proud of you. And I started crying again, but this time it was different. The aftermath happened in waves over the next several months. In July, Davis Hollenbeck sent a letter to Margaret Sauber on behalf of Brigitte, formally requesting a meeting to discuss what he called concerning developments regarding Mr. Pemberton's recent behavior and the influence of an outside party. Margaret responded with a 14-page packet that included the cognitive evaluation, the trust documents, the timeline of communications, and a copy of the original email Brigitte had sent. She also included a cover letter informing Hollenbeck that any further pursuit of guardianship proceedings would result in our office filing a complaint with the Minnesota Office of Lawyers' Professional Responsibility, given his prior 2019 sanction and the apparent pattern. Hollenbeck did not write back. In August, I received a letter from Brigitte. Handwritten, 6 pages. It was an apology of sorts. It blamed Conrad. It blamed grief. It blamed Audra. It did not, anywhere in those 6 pages, blame Brigitte. I put the letter in a drawer, and I have not opened it since. In September, Conrad's gym closed. For closure. According to a mutual acquaintance, he and Brigitte had to sell the BMW and move out of the North Loop condo. They were, last I heard, living in his mother's basement in St. Cloud. The French bulldogs had been rehomed. In October, Constance and I got married at the Eau Claire County Courthouse. 8 people came. Roland was my witness. Margaret cried during the vows, which surprised me, because I'd never seen Margaret cry about anything, including her divorce. We had dinner afterwards at a steakhouse on Water Street, and I drove Constance home, and we sat on her porch, my porch now, our porch, and we drank tea and watched the leaves come down. We left for Greece 3 weeks later. We spent 11 days on Naxos and 4 in Athens. Constance stood on the steps of the Parthenon and cried for about half an hour. I held her purse. I'm not going to describe the rest of it because some things belong to the people who lived them. I'm 71 years old. I'm writing this from the porch of the house I built. There is a woman inside making coffee who I'm going to spend whatever years I have left arguing with. The way Patricia told me to. There is a dog at my feet. There is a lake somewhere that I no longer own and that I'm at peace with no longer owning. Because the version of that lake that mattered to me lives in my memory now, and nobody can sell that or pry it loose with a lawyer's letter. My daughter has not contacted me since the apology letter in August. I don't know if she ever will again. I have made my peace with that too, although it took longer. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, whether I regret what I did, whether I should have given her another chance, whether cutting her out was too harsh. What I tell them is this. I spent 40 years designing bridges, The most important thing I ever learned in that work was that some cracks you can patch and some cracks you can't. And the discipline of the engineer is knowing the difference. You don't patch a crack that's grown into the load-bearing column. You take the whole thing down and you build something new in a different location. You do that not because you're cruel. You do it because you love whoever's going to walk across the next bridge. And the most important person walking across the bridge of the rest of your life is you. My daughter Me declared incompetent so she could sell the place where I scattered my wife's ashes. I was never going to be the bridge that carried that weight. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Hit the subscribe button, and if you have your own story about a family member who mistook your kindness for weakness, I want to hear it. There's another story coming next week about a man who let his son-in-law manage his retirement account for 6 months, and what he found when he finally looked at the statements. Until then, take care of yourselves. And remember, the people who tell you to disappear are usually the ones who can't survive without you. I've been thinking a lot lately about the morning I read that email. The cold feeling in my hands. The 40 minutes I sat in that diner booth with Roland, listening to him explain Wisconsin Statute 46.99 in a voice so calm it almost made me laugh. People who haven't lived through something like this assume the hardest part is the betrayal itself. It isn't. The hardest part is the moment afterward, when you realize that every kindness you ever extended was being logged on the other side of the ledger as a debt you owed. I want to say something honest about Brigitte. I raised her. I told her to ride a bicycle on the gravel driveway behind the lake house. I paid her tuition at Marquette. I held her hand at her mother's funeral. None of that disappeared the morning I read her email. What disappeared was my willingness to keep paying interest on a relationship that had stopped earning anything. That is not the same as cutting someone out of your heart. It's the recognition that love without respect is just subsidy, and subsidy is what people draw on until the well goes dry. The reason what happened to Brigitte happened, in the end, is the simplest reason in the world. She and Conrad spent 6 years treating my generosity like an entitlement, and entitlement, once it sets in, eats the conscience the way rust eats steel. By the time she sent that email to her husband, she wasn't even doing something cruel in her own mind. She was doing logistics. That's how far it had gone. The moment I stopped being a person to her and became an asset, the outcome was already written. I just chose when to read it aloud. If there is anything I would want a younger man to take from this story, it would be 3 things, and I'll keep them short because I am tired of pretending wisdom comes in long speeches. The first is that decency is not the same as obligation. You owe the people you love your honesty, your effort, and your presence. You do not owe them your dignity. The day they ask you for that, the transaction has changed, and you are allowed to walk away from the table. The second is that intelligence in old age looks different than intelligence in youth. It looks like patience. It looks like a 6-hour cognitive evaluation and a notarized report. It looks like calling a friend who became an accountant and listening before you speak. The world tells you that being 71 means being slow. Being 71, done right, means being precise. The third is that strength is mostly a matter of refusing to flinch at the right moment. I did not enjoy selling the lake house. I cried in a Quick Trip parking lot for 40 minutes, but I did not flinch. Constance was waiting on the porch. Patricia was, in some way I cannot explain, also waiting. And the man I needed to be for both of them was not the man who patched the crack one more time. He was the man who knew when to take the bridge down.